Hello, Ted.
Hey
Uh,
Tony, how are you?
Pretty good. Okay, let me welcome to Sunshine and Transparency. I'm Tony Christ. We have a special guest. He's a Catholic theologian. He's graduated from London School of Economics. He's published 9 books. Go to Ted Flynn, Flynn, on Amazon. And if you've got to buy one, I would say Hope of the Wicked, and that might be a place to start, Ted. I know we were having a discussion about it. Uh, Maybe you could talk to the readers about the Federal Reserve a little bit, how it came about, and uh, anything you want to add. I know your book is very thorough on it.
Well, Tony, first of all, we've known each other for coming up on 30 years, and I know you've even visited Jekyll Island, so we can talk on that level because you've even seen it. But if we want to talk about the Federal Reserve, I did do a chapter in Hope of the Wicked, which is a book of political philosophy that I released in the year 2000. That the only difference in the book today is the names have changed, but the agenda is the same. I've been asked maybe somewhere near 1,000 times, would you update it? And there really isn't anything new to say other than they're coming through with the agenda
Can
of
you tell us
control.
what
And
you talk a little bit about what the agenda is?
the agenda right now is for the global elites to take uh, total control over sovereignty in the world. And if you want to even look into what's happening in Russia, the NATO, especially when you get into the United States, France, and England, what they're really looking to do is crush Russia because Putin has said he's not going to become a member of this. And what they really want is central bank control of the currency. So back to exactly that's one of the underlying roots. And Putin actually said that several years ago, actually at Davos for their annual January meeting, where he said, we will not be giving up our sovereignty and giving the globalists central bank control. So there is a hidden thing behind the scenes that nobody really addresses. But you asked about the Federal Reserve. In 1909, J.P. Morgan was actually asked to bail out the United States, the government, due to debt. And then there was a group of about 9 families, 8 or 9 families at the time that were all very, very wealthy. And I wrote a chapter on this in Hope of the Wicked called Nothing Federal and No Reserves. There is nothing federal about the Federal Reserve. And due to fractional lending in terms of what they actually have for reserve currency, isn't even where it was many years ago at 1/4% due to the debt at 35 trillion now, give or take, another 77 off books with derivatives, which even Warren Buffett called the weapon of mass destruction for the country. We don't have anywhere near those reserves. And a bank just even a few, like last week, went belly up in Oklahoma, and they're not going to be making all of the payments for those uninsured depositors. So, this is a big roost. And one of my favorite quotes was when Walter Mondale was leaving DC. He was literally driving on Constitution Avenue, getting towards the Teddy Roosevelt Bridge. It's right on the right-hand side. And he said, before I leave Washington, he said, I really need to learn what the Federal Reserve does. So here's a man who is district attorney in Minnesota, a congressman, a senator, vice presidential, and then actually ran for president and got beat in and he lost 49 states because he was doing the unforgivable sin as a politician, literally, where he verbalized to meet the debt obligations was the only way was to raise taxes. So that cost him just 49 states. You can't say that. And so the Federal Reserve in 1913, they passed the Federal Reserve Bill, at December 24th at 8:30 p.m. By the way, that's Christmas Eve at 8:30 p.m. in a very, very underhanded way with Nelson Aldrich, who was actually related to the Rockefeller family through marriage. And he was actually a senator from Rhode Island. And on the Senate Finance Committee, they rammed the bill through. And so what they did is prior to that, they actually had a meeting in Jekyll Island, Georgia. And they met at an island that in essence J.P. Morgan owned. Andrew Carnegie owned the island next door as two of the wealthiest people in the United States. I forget what's the name of it, Cumberland. I think it was
The
Cumberland
lodge
Island.
there. Yeah, the house. I've been in the house. I don't remember the name. Uh, yeah, no, nothing federal, no reserves. Could you take a moment and talk about the precariousness of our financial system? Too many people assume we're on terra firma, and we're really not. And I think that's one of the tragedies that people aren't able to understand where we are. So could you take a minute and go over that precarious position we're in?
I will. That's arguably the most important thing that we can talk about today of how significant that issue is of what you just raised. But let me bring to completion how they underhanded form this. So these bankers, these private bankers, the Schiffs, the the Warburgs, they left from New York City on a private train. Don't forget, it was all the way back in 1913 before the actual bill passed.
1910, I believe the meeting was 1910.
That's right. And so they were working on this. The bill passed in 1913, which is,
Yeah.
I think, the single greatest con in the history of the United States to form the Federal Reserve.
And why do you call it a con?
Well, let's go back. Let me just finish this point, and then we'll get into the debt and the con. And part of the con is that they all went down under. They only used their first names, and taking a train from New York City to Jekyll Island, Georgia.
They were
They all
pretending to
brought.
be duck hunters, weren't they?
Yeah, pheasant. They actually used to bring their own pheasants out there, so they let them go and they could shoot them because it's not pheasant isn't native to there, so they brought their own pheasant in. And J.P. Morgan used to bring in his boat there, a 160-foot yacht called the Corsair, and the Corsair is actually means pirate. And so when J.P. Morgan came in, they used to blast off a big cannon so they knew that he was on the island. So they went under, they only used their first names. Half of them didn't even know how to shoot a shotgun, but they all brought shotguns under the ruse that they were going down to hunt. They were going down to actually codify and begin to work with this Federal Reserve. So it was all done in stealth. And that's part of this
Secret.
con of how shrewd this is. You have to understand, this is actually pure genius to have pulled off a thing like this. And then, the IRS came out of this whole thing. And then this all goes into the coffers of private bankers, no matter whether it's on the buy side, the debt side. All of this interest payment goes to these bankers, which is frankly the reason, they're like brokers. They just get rich on either side of it. And so, but back to the debt, which is your question. I'm a believer that we're beyond repair right now. And we can maybe get into that because I actually have some material that I just looked at in the book of the 8 stages of an empire, of the ascendancy and the decline of an empire, and we can maybe get into that. And it's fascinating stuff. It's actually not opinion, but it's historically accurate. But look at the debt. When just even a few months ago, I saw just on regular press like Drudge, we're literally accumulating $1 trillion in debt every 100 days. How does a nation pay that back?
See, I'm afraid our viewers don't understand where that's headed and what it means. and everybody's lived their every life in America and their every day, and has had food and has had plenty. And particularly, I don't think younger people understand. I don't think even older people understand where that will take us unless we can become sober instantly and address it. And like you say, it may even be too late for that.
Listen, I'm not ready to go to the medicine cabinet, but I don't have any hope that the United States government will deal with this issue. Why? Let's just look at the history of it. We have about 87%, give or take, the exact number doesn't matter because it's so large, on just four areas of entitlements: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the defense bill. 87% of the United States budget is gone in those things, and we
And that
must
doesn't
have
cover interest. The interest just
no,
surpassed a trillion.
no, and I can tell you, when you just use the word trillion, the average, not the average person, there's 1,000 millions in a billion. And we don't understand how big a trillion is. We don't understand of how much we're spending. The United States is literally addicted to spending. I saw something the other day, Dave Ramsey, who I don't watch. I know who he is. I don't need his advice on finances, but there are a lot of consumers that frankly do follow him. I respect that because we're actually financially illiterate as a culture today due to frankly just spending in the credit card. He said something to Tucker just about 3 weeks ago or less that the average American family has $37,000 in credit card debt. Now, that's from 19 to 31%. Do the math on that. Now, if you get into it, and it's basically showing that the average American is living way, way beyond their means, and all of these nice little cute girls and good-looking guys driving these new SUVs, they don't own them. They're leased. Or rented. They don't own that. They're highly leveraged. But everything is about the image of really looking good. So for me, I don't have any hope from a social anthropological standpoint of human nature that the United States is going to tackle this debt.
And when you say this, when it starts to come unhinged or unwound, what does that look like? I don't think people understand what's going to happen. And they need to know if there's any hope of addressing it, they need to understand the consequence.
Well, we've never, everybody, we talk about, most probably even more relevant has been what's happening in Argentina than maybe even the Weimar of the 1930s. Hitler actually came to power because of what happened with the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, where Europe boxed in Germany. Now, yeah, I mean, we know there's that, as Margaret Thatcher said, that German gene. We know that. But they were absolute destitute. And so when Hitler came around, he gave the people vision. They began to build again. We saw what they did with ships and planes and everything else. Their factories were humming again. So Hitler gave the people a vision. And so they latched onto that, which is why nobody spoke against what he was doing with his social policies. But I could tell you, if you were a Jew in 1938, in November 13th and 14th, or 39 with Kristallnacht, you got a bit of a taste of what was coming your way with what's called the Night of the Broken Glass. So, and people think that was over a long period of time. That was only 2 nights. So what happens, desperate nations do desperate things. So where is it headed? I mean, we all know the famous photograph of the man with a wheelbarrow in Germany bringing in money to make a payment in a wheelbarrow. And anybody who has ever paid attention more in more recent years, we could see the inflation in Argentina, which I think is one much more appropriate for our day and age than 80 or 90 years.
Yeah, and I think the next morning the wheelbarrow was stolen and the money was left alone because it was worthless. I think that's your point, and I think that's the thing people have to understand, and they don't.
When this unwinds, I mean, I have no idea. I mean, I have seen the dollar bill from Zimbabwe, where they have in Zimbabwe $1 billion bill. Someone told me there was $1 trillion bill. I don't know if that's true, but I have seen the $1 billion bill.
A college roommate of mine, Eddie Doe, William and Mary, has $1 trillion bill from
Okay,
Zimbabwe.
so there you go.
I
So
think
they
he paid
do.
a buck for it.
So I'm surprised it's even worth that. But the point is, $1 trillion bill. That's runaway inflation, to say the absolute very, very least. So where could this go when it unwinds? Could you imagine with especially this generation that has been living on credit, where whatever they want, they just go buy it. There's actually, they go get several cards easy. The bread and circus of our culture that we know from the French Revolution of Marie Antoinette, let 'em eat cake. The bread and circus of our culture, the circus is entertainment. Now, anybody now, I mean, we're on social media today. We're consumed as a culture with social media. Yesterday, from 11 o'clock in the morning till 1 o'clock at night, West Coast games. They end at 11, so we know, 11, 12, 1, or even a little bit after 11. East Coast time would be 1. You can watch football from 11 to 1. 11 a.m. to 1 a.m. right now. And then we have the hockey season in full gear. We have basketballs in full gear. We have football. So our circus today is actually entertainment, and the bread is actually credit. And it's destroying the fabric of American culture. And Dave Ramsey, he was actually literally said, when he told Tucker Carlson that, Tucker Carlson said 3 times to him, anybody that said it, "Is that true? Is that true?" 30, think of $37,000. And let's just break that up in the middle at 25%. That number is mind numbing. That's the average American family. So
Yeah.
how does it unravel? It unravels badly. So I'm
I've
not.
heard the debt. I've heard the debt is 269,000 for every taxpayer, and this was a few weeks ago. It's obviously bigger now, or 90 some thousand for every individual baby, old person in the whole system to pay it to zero, which is not very realistic.
Well, I haven't seen anybody come up with what I thought is actually a really good conclusion. But if you want to look at the Old Testament, Yahweh had a solution for this, and it was called the Jubilee year. The heaven seemed to know that human nature likes to live beyond its means, spend money they don't have, get the extension of credit to buy things they either need or don't need, usually their wants versus their needs. So I'm very, very heavily tied into, in my thinking, in basically the concept of human nature, and I've heard it said that would people be willing to sacrifice? I think the last time we spoke, you had a solution. Would people be willing to sacrifice? Now, I would be willing to sacrifice myself if I thought the government would actually spend prudently. Do I have any faith in the United States government spending prudently and wisely? I have zero to the 10th power. Would I be willing to give up anything when I see the people right now in Kentucky that were given $750 per family for the flood? and FEMA wouldn't even allow private donations going in, helicopters getting people lost. They were, are not lost, but looking to rescue people. And yet they wouldn't let private citizens. Why? Because the government wants to control everything with everybody, cradle to grave.
Yeah, and then they spend in Ukraine within weeks another 80 billion. The thing, so this could actually unfold. I mean, we could see, and it's likely we will. The question isn't could see a collapse, say to 1/5 or 1/10 the value in our money. Is that possible?
Well, you know, the question is the only way to deal with this debt to monetize it and basically give a revaluation, which there's talk about doing a revaluation in several currencies of the world, with one being Iraq and Vietnam and other things. You know, but, you know, the average country, you know, I mean, you look at what happened in Greece several years ago, where I think they were
Yeah.
able to retire at 55 years old and go on these monster pensions. And even Alan Greenspan talked about the difference of Southern Europe versus Northern Europe of their spending. Ireland, a couple of years ago, was 135% debt to GDP. Greece was off the charts due to
Yeah.
pensions. Was it 55 years old where you could go out with a full pension in Greece?
Yeah. Younger, I think.
The point is, the jig is up. We can't live like this any longer. We're going to see in our lifetime, in not too distant future, because of this debt, they're going to be cutting back Medicare. Why? Because they have no solution but to do that. And one of the reasons that also they're not talking about why they just lowered interest rates is we can't even service our own debt. There's the underlying reason why they're dropping interest rates. You know, every president wants to see low interest rates because it's better for the economy. But, you know, inflation is a hidden tax with government. I mean, somebody just told me in Northern Virginia, the average starter home is in the $700,000 range. With literally, somebody just told me the other day, a Cape Cod in Falls Church, Virginia, Northern Virginia, for people out of the area, you know, what, maybe 10, 12 miles from the DC border at the Potomac River, a starter house is 700,000, built in the late 50s. Well, guess what? That house has been depreciating in value as a dwelling, but it's the land going up because inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. So do I have hope that the United States is going to grab the bull by the horns and do the right thing? Absolutely not.
We're on the eve of a presidential election, and you haven't heard any candidate mention it. Now, you haven't heard any. A matter of fact, they're talking about gifts and cutting taxes and so forth. And no candidate is talking about the debt.
Well, this is
Why?
what presidents do. You know, my daughter went to William and Mary, and I learned a lot about William and Mary down there. You know, I guess Jefferson went there. Washington was a surveyor. I think Madison, and I don't know if Monroe was actually. They have like 4 or 5 presidents, the early presidents from William and Mary, because the school was chartered in 1693. So it goes back. It's the second oldest school in the United States after Harvard. And so I learned a lot about George Washington down there, going back and forth, in essence, over 4 years. And George Washington, to get elected the first time, he was a surveyor, but the first time he ran for election, what did Washington do? He gave out free beer to everybody. Bring them in, give them something free, get them drunk. You know, so that's how he got elected first. So presidents get elected by giving away free stuff, and we haven't seen that like ever before. anybody just even in the last 24 hours that saw Senator Fetterman on Joe Rogan, Fetterman of Pennsylvania, where he literally said the way to flip certain states was literally replacement migration. He came right out and said it. Now, years ago, the Democratic Party was hiding that. No longer, they're out in the open now. I mean, millions and millions of people coming in, and they're actually, and the Democratic Party has been moving them actually to states that they want to flip, like Texas, which they say could be in play even for Ted Cruz. And this isn't even really a political statement, but I saw something actually.
You remember, Ted, a year and a half ago, both parties got together and they got rid of the limit on the debt. There's been no limit on the debt for 18 months, and it's coming back into play in January of 2025. So they're going to, and everybody gets cynical about it, and they say, well, so what? So they're going to raise the limit, obviously. But the point is, what if we've hit a spot of no return? We've gone now for close to 2 years with no limit on the debt. There used to be a discussion annually about it. The ceiling was raised, and now we're approaching uh, a dead period in January where they're going to have to raise it again. Is there? I mean, I wonder about the government agencies, CBO, GAO. Uh, their estimates, when they estimate the future, don't seem to be realistic. And I wonder very much if we're not going to have some consequences coming up in the next 2 years to this just ferocious, uncontrollable, out of control spending, that binge that we've been on for Trump's last year and for Biden's the first 3 years. What is there going to be a consequence coming up to this, or do you?
Yeah, but again, I mean, we have a situation, you and I have lived in the DC area for our whole adult lives, and you even before that. I've been following about these government shutdowns now every single year. And the Republicans as a group really just don't want to tax and spend and fund these programs. And they try to get a handle on it, but they know that if they cut certain budgets, they themselves won't get reelected. So the fact of the matter is, nobody really wants to tackle the budget issue. Why? Because when a congressman or a senator is in REM sleep, they're thinking about getting elected. Now they have to, all a congressman does, there's a building up in Washington where it's dialing for dollars, where they go over and spend so many dollars, so many hours a week or a month raising money for the RNC from their constituents. And with that program, they know that if there's a big benefactor in a certain state, that they expect something with a government contractor their way, coming their way from government. And that's why Lockheed has plants, actually, Lockheed Martin has plants in 35 states, because that means they've got 70 senators that won't come against them, because that's jobs in their district. And in that district, they own 35 congressmen, because unless there's more plants in a state. So what congressman will even go after the issue of the continuing resolution? Now, I saw something with Ben Bernanke several years ago that I'll never, ever forget it. Helicopter Ben. In other words, he studied the big event at Princeton, MIT and Princeton. And that the big event was the Depression. And so, I think he wrote his thesis on it. And so he was sitting in front of Senator Schumer way back. And Senator Schumer, as a member of the Senate Finance Committee, said something very, very perceptive to him that most people would have missed. They were talking about the budget and spending, and Schumer, as a New Yorker, and then you've got New Jersey and Delaware that have places on the Senate Finance Committee for obvious reasons as the financial centers. He said, Chairman Bernanke, take a good look at what's in front of you and go back and sharpen your pencil. Which what he was really saying is, we can't control our spending up here. You need to go back and just release more dollars through the Federal Reserve, through the M1, through dollars in the system. So that's what he was saying to him. But you would have known to what he was really saying. Go back and sharpen your pencil. We can't control ourselves here. We're going to give the constituents whatever they want because we need to get reelected. We like it here. We like the perks.
Should people get prepared for what's coming? I have a feeling that well over half of America has no idea, and a large percent of the other half have very varying ideas. But are there things we could do or should do to prepare for a collapse in the dollar, which is what I think we're talking about?
Well, it all depends on how much you can do. I've studied this from a longitudinal all the way back to the Roman Empire, which we can even get into empire building in a minute. The Romans in Rome proper, there's a Latin phrase called latifundia, which is where the Roman citizens during the collapse of the Roman Empire, it officially fell in 454, but for all practical purposes, Rome was actually in a deteriorated state with what was called the brutes, and the Caesars, like Diocletian, like Caligula and others, where they're in a complete reprobate state. And they were completely lost morally as a culture. So what the Romans did, they actually went outside of Rome and began to grow their own food on small farms. So, it's very, very limited due to resources, which you can really do today. I think if I
Well,
would get,
we could advise our viewers at least. I would think it's good advice to get out of debt. I mean,
well,
I think
that would be my absolute first. My first, to the degree that you can actually pay off all debt. Now, first would be, the highest interest, whether it's credit card or whatever, whether it's a credit card loan, whatever it would be, or car. So
I mean,
what is it going?
normally, if you look back on America in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was normal for a younger person getting into business to take out loans and leverage the money. This is not that time. I guess I wanted to say that just to impress upon the younger people who might be being enticed to do that, but this is not the right time to do that.
Well, I mean, all I could say is that people need, if they can, they need to whittle down their debt. There's an old saying, it's from the book of Proverbs: the borrower is servant to the lender. End of story. The borrower is servant to the lender. So to the degree that you can pay down debt, own your own vehicles. For me, I've been keeping everything I own in a complete state of repair. So I've done what I can. If we look at inflation like we think it could possibly go to wild unwinding, we're all going to be terribly, terribly hurt. I mean, listen to any mother with a family talk of her what she's putting in a grocery bag for $100. And it's just not a whole lot, and people are cutting back. They're going to have to sacrifice, and do what they need to do. So I think to get out of debt as fast as you can, paying off your high interest first. If you have a note on a vehicle, trade it back in, sell it, and get a cheaper car that is still really reliable. get an older Honda or Toyota that, frankly, if you take care of them, can easily go to 200,000 miles. You're going to need to do what you can do. But I don't know
And
if
if you're
there's the
preparing to
resolve.
buy a house, maybe hold off a little until
Yeah.
you see these bigger questions come up with solutions, hopefully.
Jeff Bezos even said himself, as Amazon said, he didn't grow up wealthy. He worked on his parents' ranch in Texas as a Montessori type, early education. And he said literally like 6 months ago to hold off on big purchases due to inflation. So the debt situation, do what you can to keep everything in a state of repair. I just had my coils replaced. They were going bad in my heat pump. And, there's nothing like a good roof. I love my roof. It's a wonderful thing. In even HVAC salesmen, they're not actually called a salesman for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. If you ever look at their cards, they're called comfort specialists. There's marriages that break up over thermostat wars, So you should do what you can to keep everything in a state of repair to where it's functioning and prepare as best you can. For me personally, I'm not a prepper. If you take, people would think with my mentality, I would be. I have what I call a healthy pantry. But if you Socratically or inductively or deductively go through the entire thought process of what you can do to avert disaster, there's frankly only so many things you can really do.
Right. So, yeah, but, and if anything, we're trying to lift people's awareness of this. The election is contentious. The election is going to be over in a week. Whoever goes in office, whoever ends up in a month uh, as the next president, they're going to face what we're talking about. And neither one has given any hint, although intuitively people are going to favor one over the other. Neither one has given us a plan of what they're going to do about this. And this is on top of us. By the end of the year, we're going to be above what, 36 trillion in another 2 months.
Yeah, or more, and that's not even the stuff that's off balance sheet, which I've seen is 77 trillion. And a lot of the world is in the same situation. Japan carries their own debt internally. We have a lot of the European nations that have been looking at the United States of the way us as the reserve currency with profligate, reprobate spending. And frankly, the world is getting tired of it. They're seeing our spending frivolously, carelessly, casually, and every synonym that is anywhere resembles irresponsible. Now, would the average American be willing to sacrifice if they literally saw 50, 80 billion going over to the Ukraine in the last month, and now we're putting troops over in the Middle East? I don't think they're ready for it. Tony, I don't know if you'd want to get into if it's something you'd even care to discuss, but in the book I did, Hope of the Wicked, I actually get into the stages of all empires. We're the 23rd great empire, according to Yakuta, Will and Ariel Durant, not so much people like William Manchester that were the 20th century historians, Toynbee and others, from Chatham House in England. But we are following all of the exact same steps of how the United States rose. And we're, in essence, if you took a look with the Mayflower coming here with William Bradford in 1620, we're 404 years old. If you look at it all the way from the origin of hard work and resourcefulness, of which, the whole thing of the prudent pilgrim, with, because if they didn't do it on their own, they frankly perished. So let me go over what I think your audience may find as fascinating steps that may be actually foreign to them, and they've never
Go
actually
over it, and then afterwards I'm going to read what Tytler said too, uh, back in the 1600s. But go ahead.
of what who said in 1600s.
Tytler, Tytler,
Oh,
Alexander.
Tyler.
Well, Tyler was another guy. He came about 80 years later, and they both said it.
And
So,
he's the he
but
is
Tytler
Tyler
was
is the
first.
Scott, he's the Scottish.
They're
Yeah,
both
I've
Scottish.
actually
They're both Scottish historians. Alexander Tytler was also a Scottish historian. But go ahead, go down your list. And
this is either from Tytler or Tyler. I've always ascribed it to Tyler, and you may be right on that. So that's
I've got 4 pages in front of me that are in the same sort of a quarry. They're not sure which one it was, but go ahead.
okay. So everywhere from the Greeks, the Romans, the Sumerians, the Persians under Azarias, the greatest land kingdom in the world. You had the French under the Sun Kings of Louis the 14th, 15th, and 16th, 14, 15, and 16, the Sun Kings, where Louis the 14th said, L'État c'est moi, the state is me. So these people had incredible sway, but they, in essence, bankrupted their cultures. And then you had Spain under the Armada, where they sailed the seas, and that's why Queen Isabella was able to give the insurance to Christopher. Columbus didn't sail with his 3 ships until he was insured by Queen Isabella. So the listeners can get these 8 stages, and they can decide where they are themselves or where they think we are. But every single
Empire.
historian recognizes this as very, very accurate to the ascendancy and descent of all previous empires. The first stage is bondage. The people are subject to an authority other than themselves. By the way, these things don't need explanation. Spiritual faith. People develop a sense of identity through a faith in God and come to have a purpose. All they got to do is go back and look. Courage. They develop a sense of where they need to go to further themselves as a race. They venture out, breaking away from the shackles of their bondage. Freedom. They gain freedom and self-rule. Hard manual work and a sense of fulfillment bring an identity to the civilization. Laws are made to govern themselves. Abundance, hard work, identity, self-gratification, and accomplishment bear fruit. Risk over generations becomes worthwhile. Anybody who is probably over the age of 40 in America today can see their grandparents in these. And if they're probably over the age of 50 or 60, and especially 70 and up, they can see how their parents sacrificed for their kids and frankly worked themselves into a bone. Also, meanwhile, with faith. The next one is selfishness. Human nature forgets that it is God who grants favors. Lack of cooperation in aiding others less fortunate sets in as creature comforts are sought. Apathy. Now, without getting into too much, we're beginning to see where we're headed, especially into these last 3. Apathy, a cynical approach sets in as effort seems worthless, i.e., how many people don't want to start a business today due to regulations? In abundance, there is no spiritual development, thus they lose their vision of the higher good. They become a spiritual wasteland. Dependence, laws cripple initiative, answers are looked for in all the wrong places, and there is no sense of purpose in life as ease of lifestyle is sought, and the civilization is conquered from without or decays from within. They are back to walking the road of bondage, but they may not even know it. So people may know what actually Abraham Lincoln talked about, that the United States would never be conquered from without, but it would lose because we were simply too big, but we would lose ourselves from within.
So
So
it's bondage to spiritual faith to courage, courage to liberty, liberty to abundance, abundance to selfishness, selfishness to apathy, apathy to dependence, and from dependence back into bondage. And what a way to put it, Ted. I mean, that hits that should hit a lot of viewers right where it hurts. And these words were said by Titler or Tyler. They've been attributed apparently to Toynbee to a lot of different people. And you put it exactly right. It's a cycle. Is there, you like to feel hopeful. You like to feel there's hope and opportunity. And I'm one that thinks that we're going to find a way out of this, but history has shown differently. And this might be a point at which we should stop our podcast because I can't imagine making a bigger point than this. But go ahead, Ted. Any final
I got
thoughts
to
for
tell
our
you,
listener?
really just a super quick story about this abundance, from apathy to abundance and selfishness. This is something that happened to me many years ago. I was on a speaking tour of 3 states. In the last state, this was in about the year 2010. And I was in Indiana in the airport, and I hadn't slept much in, frankly, 3 days. I was really, really tired. And up into the end with American Airlines, I had 1.2 million frequent flyer on American Airlines alone. So I divided roughly the circumference of the Earth at 25,000 miles, and I divided that into 1.2 million. And I had been around the world 48 times in 12 years. So I was tired. So I got to the airport, and they said that it was 1 week before the Indy 500, and the airport was absolutely crazy in Indianapolis. So the lady said, "Sir, you're being bumped until the flight in 6 hours later." I said, "Ma'am, pull up my frequent flyer number." So she said, "Wow, you've flown a lot with us." I said, "Ma'am, out of every single person in this airport, I'm the last one you want to bump today, because when I don't sleep, I get really cranky." And so she saw the humor in it. She put me in first class, which I don't fly first class much at all. I always end up there by mistake. And so she put me in first class just to get me on it, because she saw how many miles I had, in essence, paying her salary, right? I'm a good customer. So you don't want to tick off your really good customers. And so I'm in the front, and I'm talking. I meet a guy, and as it turns out, he's a priest, and he had just married. I'm right next to him, and he's a Catholic priest, and he had just married Emerson Fittipaldi. And so we were talking, and they didn't pay him. And so, as it turns out, this guy raised money for the missions by being the chaplain for the NASCAR and the open wheel circuit. So but he's not into racing at all, but he raises money for missionary vehicles all over the world, whether it's a bike, a Jeep, or whatever it is. And so we were just talking, and I said, "What do you see now in the last number of years?" He said, "It's really interesting." He said, "I've been doing this for 25 years. And he said, "I knew a lot of these people's parents, like A.J. Foyt and all of these people." He said, "When they won a race, these people came up hard. They scratched for everything they got." He said, "After a big race, they may give me $25,000 for the missions, even if they're not Catholic." He said, "because we were providing missionary vehicles, from everything from a bike to a scooter to a motorcycle to a Jeep, in the outback." And so we were talking, and I said, "So what do you say today? What do you see?" And he said, they have boats, they have multiple farms, they've got teams, they have multi-million-dollar houses. Some of them have private jets. And he said, they may give me, after a race, $500, where their parents gave me $20,000 when they had 1/20th of what they have today. But it gets back into this apathy, selfishness, and they didn't work for it. They, by and large, were given it, and they don't have the same heart for this mentality of giving because they've gone into this selfishness. So it isn't, I don't have a defeatist attitude, but I feel I've got a very realistic attitude on the culture.
We're with Ted Flynn. We've been listening to him, uh, Catholic theologian, London School of Economics, author of 9 books. Look them up and get one under Ted Flynn on Amazon. And Ted, we thank you for taking time. And it's so true. People are more selfish and more egocentric than they ever have been. And we're going to wish our readers, our listeners, a good week. I say readers, I'm in good shape. And we're going to tell them to have a blessed week. And we want to thank you, Ted, for coming on for us. And any last word before we close down? We're approaching an hour.
Buckle in. It's not gonna be a dull 2025. For those who don't even know the time, this is Monday, and the national election happens to be tomorrow.
Yep.
So it's a Monday, and the national election is Tuesday. So I think it's buckle in, because I think the remaining, I think the next 12 months are going to be flat out wild.
Wow. Thank you, Ted. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I always enjoy it.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
Okay.